And the clock is ticking down to April 22nd. As of Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the United States Navy is positioned at the Strait of Hormuz, stopping ships bound for Iranian ports. And then Trump told reporters and then the New York Post that Iran has been in touch, that talks could be happening over the next 2 days. He told ABC this morning, "I think you're going to be watching an amazing 2 days ahead." Iran's side says there is, quote, "no information about a second meeting." Meanwhile, 3 things happened yesterday that will define the shape of this conflict beyond the strait. Italy, one of Israel's closest European allies, suspended its defense agreement with Israel, and Lebanon sat down with Israel in Washington for their first direct diplomatic talks since 1993. Hezbollah refused to comply with any agreement reached without it. I am Zunaira Azhar, and you're watching Decode, where we define and analyze the stories shaping the world around us. 3 connected stories, 1 common thread. A world that was holding its breath is now moving fast. The blockade, the backlash against Israel, and the Lebanon sticking point. Let's decode all of 3. Trump announced the blockade on Sunday right after the Islamabad talks. It went live Monday at 10 a.m. Eastern. According to U.S. Central Command, the blockade applies to all ships entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas. It covers the Arabian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, and the Arabian Sea east of the strait. But CENTCOM specifically stated it will not impede freedom of navigation for vessels transitioning the strait to and from non-Iranian ports. In other words, ships going to Bandar Abbas are. Trump said it more sweepingly. He said the Navy would seek and indirect every vessel in international waters that has paid on toll to Iran. He warned that any Iranian ships coming near the blockade would be, his word, eliminated. The gap between the CENTCOM language and the presidential language is itself a story. One is a precision instrument, the other is a maximalist threat. The U.S. military says more than 10,000 service members, a dozen warships, and dozens of aircrafts are participating in this operation. CENTCOM stated that in the first 24 hours, no ships made it past the blockade bound for Iranian ports. However, ship tracking data told a slightly different story. At least 4 Iran-linked vessels crossed the strait on Tuesday. 2 of them, U.S.-sanctioned, Chinese-owned tankers not headed to Iranian ports and therefore technically outside the blockade's scope. Reuters confirmed a Chinese-owned tanker named Rich Starry passed through despite sanctions. What is confirmed? Little traffic is entering or leaving Iranian ports in the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. Ship tracking data shows the blockade is having an effect on ships bound for Iran specifically. What is also confirmed? Iran has already reduced the strait's traffic by over 90% since the war began on February 28. So, the blockade is tightening a choke point that was already nearly shut. The incremental effect on Iran-Israel, but may be narrower than the headlines suggest. Iran does not have a buffer. Approximately 127 million barrels of crude is floating storage as of February. That buys time. But the blockade cuts off both export revenue and the toll-free income Iran was collecting from ships it was allowing through. Al Jazeera's estimate, Iran was generating significant revenue from those tolls. That income stream is now cut. Trump told reporters the blockade was designed to force Iran to reopen strait and accept Washington's term. But what the blockade actually does is it removes Iran's only remaining economic weapon. Iran has been using the strait like a revenue instrument, charging tolls, controlling passage, holding 230 tankers hostage inside the Gulf. The blockade affects that strategy indeed, but it also raises a question Trump has not answered yet cleanly. What happens when China remains unaffected? China imports more than 80% of Iran's shipped oil and has called the blockade dangerous and irresponsible. If Chinese tankers keep moving Iranian oil through dark fleet operations, the blockade becomes merely symbolic than surgical. So, the enforcement ceiling is not the strait, it's Beijing. And then there is domestic U.S. dimension as well. U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright said on Monday that oil prices will likely keep climbing until meaningful ship traffic gets through the strait. Gas prices in America are at $4.12 a gallon. Trump's political advisors are watching the November midterms. The blockade must produce a deal or produce lower gas prices before the political cost exceeds the strategic gain. The window is 8 days. April 22nd is the ceasefire expiry. So, the blockade is a pressure instrument, but pressure only produces deals when it changes someone's calculation. Has it changed Iran's? That is the question. We bring in our guest and we want to know, what is Trump's amazing 2 days a real signal, or is it gas price management? We have been joined by Sardar Masood Khan, former ambassador to US and UN. He has also been an ambassador to China and also an ex-president of Azad Jammu and Kashmir. Thank you so much, Ambassador Masood, for joining us. Let's begin with reflecting on what you think happened in the first round, if that was the first round of talks between Iran and US, and do you see the second one coming?
In the first session, there were some historic achievements. Pakistan enabled the United States and Iran to sit across the table face to face and discuss very thorny issues. So this was an achievement itself. It was preceded by a ceasefire for 2 weeks. So these were some of the achievements, and this background was quite positive for the engagement between the two sides. At that time, substantively, we were investing in symbolism of this mediation process, and also the lowest common denominator substantively that could come out of this entire process. I think that there was this lowest common denominator which was identified, although it was not reduced to an agreement on memorandum or any protocol. But what the two sides did, that after engaging each other, they gave public statements. They came from the highest levels of leadership from both sides, and their feedback was quite positive, that they engaged each other with the empathy, with the respect, and the atmosphere of the talks was very good, and Pakistan achieved something was unimaginable for the rest of the international community, including all other countries which were striving for brokering mediation, peace, and so on. The second part of your question is, what do we foresee? I think there is a momentum. I have said that when the leaders of the two delegations went back to the capitals, it was not an end to the mediatory process. It was work in progress. They took back not only a sense of what their interlocutors' red lines were, or where they could agree to a median point, but they also went back with the confidence that they could resume this process. In the meantime, of course, as you know, that President Trump decided to impose a blockade around the Strait of Hormuz, and that has changed the situation, I would say slightly, not radically, because there has been no exchange of fire, and the ceasefire, temporary ceasefire, holds. Now, the next round would be very significant. There are some internal dissensions, particularly in the United States. I mean, let's identify the two issues which are ready for compromise. One is the nuclear deal, and the second is Strait of Hormuz. There would be some sort of agreement between the two sides. But then there are other issues which are a priority for the United States of America, would elude any compromise on the Iranian side. And they were, I would like to identify, the reduction of the range of ballistic missiles, one. Second is the dismantlement of the regional allies of Iran. So these would be, and these are, by the way, Israel's top priorities as well, which is a very, very close ally of the United States of America.
True.
And of course, I mean, they have started this process on Lebanon. So on the Iranian side,
but all of this is also Iran's leverage. Why would it want to give it away unless they offer something really substantive to Iran?
That's right. And on the Iranian side, I would like to say that they too have red lines. For instance, they are wanting some role in the governance of, not some role, I mean, they've asserted their authority, sovereign authority over the Strait of Hormuz on their side. And they are in talks with Oman, because Oman is the other country which is bang opposite the Iranian territory. So they have to come to an agreement about sharing whatever toll they would charge. But the United States has also evinced interest in becoming a participant. But the other red lines that I would allude to, that not red lines, in fact, demands by the Iranian government are reparations for the war damages, and the United States is not likely to pay them. Or they have said that the United States should evacuate or withdraw all its troops and closest bases in the Middle East and address all the issues and a comprehensive ceasefire, not just between the United States and Iran, but also between Israel and Lebanon. A mediatory process has been started between Israel and Lebanon, but I think that the talks that took place in Washington yesterday, they are trying to disarm the Hezbollah, and that's something which is very difficult for Lebanon to do. That's something very difficult to which Iran would agree. So, and Israel, everybody knows that they are pursuing their Gaza policy in Lebanon. I mean, they're destroying houses. They have occupied territory up to the Litani River and up to Zahrani River, and they're demolishing houses. And when they started the operation, they said that they would turn Lebanon, its southern part in particular, into Gaza, another Gaza. These demolition squads there, dismantling houses and destroying infrastructure. So that's where we are. But at the same time, I have analyzed it, but the task of a mediator, Pakistan, is to bridge these differences. And that can be done through quiet diplomacy, back-channel diplomacy, which Pakistan is pursuing. And Pakistan is right now consulting Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. So I think that this is Pakistan is moving with confidence, with resilience. There have several statements have been given by President Trump, reposing his confidence in Pakistan's leadership, particularly Field Marshal Asif Munir and Prime Minister of Pakistan. And this is a good omen. And if you listen to the chatter in Israel, they're hoping that United States would not make any compromise on things which are priorities for them. And that the likely scenario would be that this temporary ceasefire would be extended for another period of 2 months or 2 weeks or a month or so, and until the President of the United States has used all his diplomatic coercive tools to influence Iran's position.
Do you really think that there is a difference of opinion when it comes to the ceasefire between Trump and Netanyahu? Because it seems that at one end, there is this sticking point called Strait of Hormuz. It's a global shock that everybody is absorbing, so it's understandable. But when it comes to Lebanon, only making Israel sit across Lebanese government is not enough, definitely. And we all know that US is one country that enjoys a lot of leverage over Netanyahu. So had Trump been more serious about all the ceasefire efforts to go successful, it could have been very easy for him to instruct to implement the ceasefire in Lebanon as well, but that is not happening. How do you read it?
Well, having lived in the United States for a very long time, I can tell you, and this is my impression, I may be wrong, but I think that the United States doesn't have full influence over Israel. Israel, on the other hand, has enormous outsized influence in the United States of America. And as you mentioned, the United States has global responsibilities. The International Monetary Fund has made some dire predictions if this crisis prolongs. This year, I think the global growth rate is about 3%, but if this prolonged war, it would plummet to 2% next year. And inflation, which is at about 3 to 4%, would spiral up to 6%. And this would trigger recession, global recession.
Yeah.
Of course, the United States and other developed countries would be affected. But the worst affected countries would be the developing countries. So I think US has global responsibilities, whereas Israel has this agenda of Greater Middle East. It is its agenda, its foreign policy, its war goals are Middle East centric. So there is an obvious variance between their positions and also the goals that they have. The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who you were talking about, he said publicly that their goals vis-a-vis Iran have not been achieved. And there should be regime change, and there should be a reduction in the range of their ballistic missiles down to 2,000 max, 2,000 kilometers.
What do you make out this blockade? Trump says that it is complete and total. CENTCOM's language is more of a surgical nature, that it is applying only to ships going towards Iranian ports. Meanwhile, China-owned sanctioned tankers are still moving through. How effective is this blockade actually, and what is the meaning of it in the first place? Does it need to look like a practice before Iran decides the cost of holding out exceeds the cost of a deal?
From the United States, it's coercive diplomacy. In fact, they want to force Iran into scuttling their position on the Strait of Hormuz. It is not working. As a matter of fact, the Iranians have also taken a very strong stance, and they say that if the ships pass through the blockade, they would target them. And there's some footage suggesting that some clashes, not physical clashes, but I mean verbal clashes, have already taken place in the Strait.
Yeah.
But at the same time, let me also tell you that the real goal here is that let me remind what your question was, because I lost the thread.
We're talking about how effective this blockade is in the first place.
Well,
is this really wrecking the economy
yes.
of Iran?
Yes, I think that the Iranians have said very boldly that they have land borders and that they can survive, that they would outlive this kind of blockade. And I think that, as you said, that this is not, although President Trump asserts that this is a total blockade, it is not, because Chinese tankers, oil tankers, and other cargo ships are passing through the strait. So it's not total, it's quite flexible. If it was a total blockade, the other countries, other littoral states of the Persian Gulf would be affected very badly, and that's not happening. So that's where we are, but it is putting pressure on Iran, and it also is triggering a direct confrontation between the United States and China. And the United States at this point doesn't want this, because it doesn't want another economic war. It doesn't want to escalate the situation vis-a-vis China, because in May, the presidents of the United States and China are scheduled to meet, and they have other issues besides this issue. So
Sardar Masood, correct me if I'm wrong, while there are active negotiations going on, there were still tensions in the Strait of Hormuz. We were having news, we couldn't talk of it, but there were tensions over there. And a lot of radios could hear the warnings going along. A lot of analysts are saying that this blockade is an act of war. So are you correlating the act of war and coercive diplomacy here, that Trump is using every tactic to enforce his line of action on Iran?
Well, the Iranians have called it piracy, and the United States have called the blockade, the Iranian blockade, or the Iranian supervision of the strait.
They call it extortion. What Iranians are doing is extortion.
Yeah, they're calling it extortion. So they are eyeball to eyeball, but they haven't attacked each other. So this is the redeeming feature. So the ceasefire holds. The other danger is, I mean, for the talks, that President Trump is shifting the goalposts.
Yes.
For instance, I mean, you would recall that Vice President J.D. Vance had talked about a 20-year moratorium. I mean, this was leaked to the press, and we know that on Iran's nuclear enrichment. But President Trump is unhappy with that. He's asking for indefinite moratorium. Why for 20 years? And you would recall that the Iranian side was insisting on 5-year moratorium.
Yeah.
So I think that we will have to see how Pakistan can play its constructive and productive role amidst these shifting sands.
Thank you so much, Sardar Masood Khan, for your time. You're always very kind.
Thank you.
A blockade that is squeezing Iran and its effects are rippling back to the world. But the blockade is only one dimension of the pressure building on this crisis. The second dimension is the one that was already happening before anyone heard of Islamabad: Israel. It's losing its international backing, including from the allies who were once its most reliable friends. Italy moved yesterday, and a story in the New York Times says Israelis returning home from bunkers are beginning to ask the question Netanyahu has not answered yes. That is the segment what we decode next. Stay tuned. Yesterday, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, a right-wing conservative leader, one of Netanyahu's most reliable European allies, announced that her government would suspend the automatic renewal of Italy's defense agreement with Israel. The agreement, originally signed in 2003, covers the exchange of military equipment, cooperation on technology research, joint military training and information technology. It renews every 5 years automatically. It expired on Monday and Rome chose not to renew it. Israel's foreign ministry immediately tried to downplay the decision, saying, "We have a memorandum of understanding from many years ago that has never contained any substantive content. This will not affect Israel's security." But that framing misses the political significance entirely. Meloni is not a left-wing progressive. She is part of the same European right that has been Israel's shield against institutional pressure. When she moves, it signals that the political calculation has changed even among Israel's natural allies in Europe. The immediate trigger: Israeli's forces reportedly fired warning shots at a convoy of Italian UN peacekeepers in Lebanon. Italy has troops serving under a UN mandate in southern Lebanon. When your ally starts shooting at your soldiers, the politics of solidarity collapse fast. Italy has also denied a US request on March 27 to land an aircraft at naval base in Sicily for a Middle East operation. France and Spain denied similar requests. This is NATO territory being close to NATO's lead member over a war those countries did not choose to join. This was NATO not responding to Israel. But a more consequential story may be happening right inside the Israel itself. Netanyahu announced the war on February 28 with 3 explicit aims: destroy Iran's nuclear program, degrade its missile arsenal, and create the conditions for the regime to fall. He told Israelis this would be a decisive and total victory. He compared Israel's strikes to the 10 plagues of Egypt. 6 weeks later, the assessment from Israeli media itself is stark. None of the 3 war aims have been fully realized. Iran's nuclear program was significantly degraded, yes, but its enriched uranium stockpile, the most dangerous part according to them, was not destroyed. Half of Iran's missile launchers are still assessed to be intact, many now being excavated from underground. And the regime has not fallen. You can have a look at the satellite images reviewed by CNN showing Iran is already using front-end loaders to clear debris from the entrances to its underground missile cities during the ceasefire. The strikes blocked tunnel entrances. Iran is digging them back out. Israeli opposition leader, who is not an anti-war voice, a mainstream centrist who supports the campaign, responded to Netanyahu's 10 plagues speech with a blunt video rebuttal. And I quote, he said, "Netanyahu is unable to reach a strategic resolution. The time has come for change." He also publicly criticized the decision to not renew Italy's defense MOU, calling it another embarrassing failure by the Prime Minister. CNN's reporting on internal Israeli solidarity shows the cracks clearly Netanyahu's coalition passed the 2026 budget last weekend, a budget that cuts education and healthcare while funding ultra-Orthodox coalition partners who are exempt from the military service. The Israeli army acknowledges a shortfall of 15,000 soldiers. Reservists have served hundreds of days of active duty across Gaza, Lebanon, and now Iran. The budget protects the coalition. It does not serve the war. Netanyahu is also still fighting his fraud and bribery trial. He has formally requested a presidential pardon. Trump publicly pressured the president to grant it. Two Israeli sources told CNN that Trump's interventions were coordinated with Netanyahu's inner circle. That story. An Israeli prime minister conducting a war while engineering his own legal escape is the story Israelis returning from the bunkers are beginning to process and ask. So, the question Netanyahu has not answered is every Israeli who is coming out of a bunker after 6 weeks of war is entitled to ask, what did we achieve? And Netanyahu cannot answer that question clearly. Polls show that Netanyahu's coalition is losing support. 3 weekend polls showed that it's dropping. His government is holding power on a budget that entrenches his coalition's survival until October elections. The people paying the price? The reservists who have served hundreds of days, the families who came out of bunkers to find their questions unanswered, are the audience for that political reckoning. Let's bring in our guest on what Israel's isolation cost it and what it cost the broader diplomatic effort to end this conflict. We have with us Ali Kechishti, who is actually a PhD. So Dr. Ali Kechishti, who is a counterterrorism and security expert. Thank you so much, Ali, for joining us. I was reading about this news that Italy is also withering away from Israel. Meloni is a right-wing conservative, not a left-wing anti-Israel voice. She was one of Israel's most reliable European ally, let's put it this way. When she suspends the defense MOU, what signal does that send to the remaining European center-right that has been Israel's political shield? Is this a tipping point or an isolated incident triggered specifically by the Italian peacekeepers who were being fired on in Lebanon?
I think it's a bit of both. I think we just need to go back. Do remember the Israelis have not only attacked Iran, but if you remember, the Israelis attacked Qatar. And I think attacking Qatar was a tipping point. I would call it more of a Stalingrad moment for Israelis when they attacked Qatar. It's only after the Israelis attacked Qatar, Saudi Arabia reached out to Pakistan for a defense agreement, which you see being invoked today. So you see Italy going back, reassessing, along with a lot of other European unions. To remember, of course, it was the French and, of course, other Spain, to other European nations who actually accepted the two-state solution and, of course, gone to accept the Palestine as, of course, a state itself. So it's just not Italy, but, of course, it's a Europeans now realizing that, of course, Israelis have been not just been a proxy, but a troublemaker, which are, not only embarrassing them, but of course had been responsible for putting their economic interest at risk, of course, in the Middle East and the Gulf. So this is, of course, so the Italians, from my understanding, has seen this, of course, attack on Iran, and of course what has happened in Lebanon, and of course this irresponsible attitude from the Israelis of not actually adhering to, at times, the ceasefire which was brokered by the French and the Italians in Lebanon, and of course in any other countries, of course. So they've actually realized what the Gulf or the Pakistanis or the realized yesterday. So it's good that, of course, they realized and they're reassessing their strategic terms, and this tells a lot.
How much of it is because of the public pressure? Because we've seen how the public opinion on Netanyahu and Israel has changed across Europe, across US. How much of it is a policy decision, and how much of it is the public-based sentiment?
It's a bit of both. So you see, public is, of course, overwhelmingly, of course, against Israelis. But I don't think government, of course, adhere to Israel's, of course, to actually going ahead, breaking this, of course, strategic defense agreement.
And defense agreements, yeah, that's my point. Yeah.
Yeah, but Israelis, so it's more to do with the policy decision, of course, with the Italians and major European countries now see, of course, Israel, or the proximity with Israel would actually come with a cost, which is economic cost. So a lot of the defense agreement, you see, Italians were, by the way, supplying nuclear submarines to Qatar. And if you all remember that episode in Qatar where, of course, the Indian sailors were caught. They were working on an Italian submarine. So you see, so we need to remember this, of course, this convergence of how any government which has actually now been considered close to the Israelis would be a security risk in the Middle East, or would put their economic stake at risk, be it trade, of course, or defense agreements. So it's the Middle East versus Israel now, and that is, to me, it's more to do with politics and, of course, economics than anything else. Yes.
What about Netanyahu? He announced 3 war aims publicly. 6 weeks in, none have been fully achieved. Iran is digging its missile launchers back out of the underground. We have seen the satellite imagery. And the regime is damaged, yes, but it's still governing and it's functional. Can Netanyahu manage these both internal and external dynamics past October elections?
I think they would, and somehow, as long as the Americans are behind it, of course, the Israelis would show some teeth. I think there's but of course, I think there's how do I put it? I think there is, of course, some sort of a confusion that it's the Israelis who control the Americans, but of course it's not. It's the other way around. It's the Americans who use Israelis as some sort of a good cop, bad cop policy, where they actually put on Israelis.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting what you're saying, because I believe most of the people believe the otherwise. So can you say more on this?
Yeah, so I think if historically it's the Americans, of course, who used Israelis as to do their dirty jobs and then go for the negotiations. So this was actually seen in Iran, by the way. So they put on the Israelis and, on what we call the plausible deniability part, where they, of course, use the Israelis to attack certain places or the strategic places where the Americans don't want to. And, of course, then take that leverage and talk and, of course, get more leverage out from the negotiation. So this is historic, of course. This is how, this is Western hypocrisy at its peak. You've seen how not just Americans, but the UK and, of course, all these European countries have, at times used Israel to get maximum leverages out from the Gulf. And apparently the good part is, of course, that somehow the Gulf has realized that the Americans, or this proximity with the Americans or the Westerns, and of course this convergence with Israelis are costing them. So so I always say, of course, as I've said before, that somehow attack on Qatar was a pivotal point by Israelis, and I call it the Stalingrad, as of course the Indian Stalingrad when it attacked Pakistan. I think the Israeli Stalingrad was, of course, attacking Qatar, and actually that somehow started this spiral, and of course they've gone into Iran not once but twice. I see, of course, at the same time, in long term, the Americans would be somehow ditching the Israelis, because they've become, I think the expiry date for the Israelis or the American relationship is close, and I think
at least the fractures are there. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, of course, and of course, and you see Americans distancing themselves from Israel's actions in Iran, and of course you'd see this this new negotiation which will be happening, inshallah, in Islamabad, of course, or anywhere, of course. It will be actually started by Pakistan. So you'd see the Americans want to de-escalate, the Israelis don't, but I have a hunch that, of course, it's the Americans using Israelis, not the other way around, and using it for the leverages. But let's just see what would happen. What is happening in Lebanon is shameful. I think we've gone into National Security Council.
I'll come to that as well. Yeah. But you've actually triggered a very interesting point. And the New York Times has also reported that Israelis who are returning home from bunkers are deeply uncertain about what the war achieved and who it served. Netanyahu's coalition passed a wartime budget that cuts healthcare, raised taxes, and protects the ultra-Orthodox exemptions from military service. Now, his reservists have served hundreds of active days. Of course, they are drained as well. How secure is a common Israeli feeling right now, and what does it say about the security of the Israel when it comes to the national security of Israel? I mean.
Well, I think Netanyahu is a national security risk for Israel itself. It's become one because we need to understand this as Netanyahu's war. And just like Narendra Modi is, of course, I think they call it the motherland. Just like Narendra Modi, I think Netanyahu has gone into this war with a political objective to save himself from certain corruption charges which he's involved with, right? So we need to understand, of course, there was no strategic or, of course, political or military need to go into a campaign in Iran right now when, of course, Iran was close to making a deal with the Americans in Oman. So, of course, this absurd sort of an attack by Israelis, and now we know for the fact that, of course, the news has come out that it was the Israelis who went ahead and the Americans somehow had to come because they understood, of course, by not coming into an attack on Iran would of course means of course that Iran would retaliate into Gulf, and they did, of course. So this was an unwanted a war which was started and nobody knew what would happen, and of course see what has happened today. The world is frozen. There's been close to an economic collapse. Israel remains isolated. The Americans want de-escalation. At the same time, of course, Iran has somehow attacked Gulf, which was unthinkable. So it's a mess. And who's of course,
and nobody is benefiting from it except for
absolutely. Except for certain, I think, new political, Zionists, of course, people would have an agenda in war, of course, would be sitting in the United States, and nobody else, of course, is, or of course, people who manipulate the markets, to be honest.
True. And that involves certain politicians as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Ali Chishti, for joining us. It was a pleasure having you. Italy has moved. Israel's politics are fracturing. Its war aims are under question. But the most immediate pressure point, the one that could either unlock the whole crisis or detonate it, is the Lebanon front. Yesterday, Israel and Lebanon sat in the same room for the first time since 1993. Hezbollah said it would not comply with anything agreed. The talks lasted 2 hours and nobody called it a breakthrough. Let's decode that next, after a short break. On Tuesday at the State Department in Washington, D.C., something historically rare happened. Israeli Ambassador Yechiel Leiter and Lebanese Ambassador Nada Hamadeh sat across from each other with Secretary of State Marco Rubio facilitating. The first direct talks between Israel and Lebanon since 1993, possibly since 1983 by some accounts. The talks lasted just over 2 hours. Lebanon's ambassador described them as constructive. Israel's ambassador called them a wonderful exchange. Rubio told reporters, "We understand we are working against decades of history and complexities." All parties issued a joint statement affirming support for further talks and describing common ground on removing Iranian influence from Lebanon. The statement said negotiations could unlock significant reconstruction assistance and economic recovery for Lebanon. Hezbollah Secretary General Naim Qassem, however, called the talks a free concession to Israel. He urged Lebanon to cancel them. Hezbollah called the decision to attend a blatant violation of the National Pact, the Constitution, and the Lebanese laws. Hezbollah said it will not abide by any agreement, including renewed demands to disarm. The gap is structural. Both sides acknowledge Hezbollah is the problem. Neither has a realistic path in solving the problem. The Israel-Lebanon talks yesterday were genuinely historic in process. Two parties, technically at war since 1948, sat in a room together, and that matters. But the question nobody at the table could answer is the one that determines whether the talks ever produce anything. Who delivers Hezbollah? Lebanon cannot force Hezbollah to disarm. Israel will not accept a ceasefire that leaves Hezbollah armed. And Hezbollah, which has said it will not comply with any agreement reached without it, is taking its instructions from Tehran, which is simultaneously a table with Washington trying to negotiate its own survival. Iran is Hezbollah's patron. If Iran makes a deal with the US that includes a ceasefire in Lebanon, Hezbollah may comply. That is the only realistic path to Hezbollah standing down, which means the Lebanon front is not solvable without the US-Iran deal. And the US-Iran deal is not solvable without Lebanon being resolved. That is the circular logic that makes this crisis so hard to break. So yes, yesterday was a historic meeting. Hezbollah that refused to show up, a Lebanese government that wants peace but cannot deliver, and an Iranian negotiating team that has made Lebanon the condition for everything else. Let's bring in our guest and then build the full picture of this. Let's talk to our guest. We have Khalid Almina with us, senior journalist and analyst. Thank you so much, Mr. Khalid, for joining me. So, Lebanon question, they along with Israel sat in the same room for the first time in over 30 years. That's huge, apparently. Both sides called it constructive. Both sides went home back to an active war. Progress is described as unclear, and Hezbollah says it will not comply. What actually needs to happen for these talks to produce anything meaningful?
Well, I think the first thing the Israelis have to do is to withdraw back to their side of the border. The Israelis are always very dubious. They say talking and then they're hitting. They've killed over 2,500 people in a few days in Lebanon in cold-blooded murder. They have dropped bombs on hospitals, on emergency services. So these are all a pack of lies. And I'm not saying it in a propagandistic manner, but I truly believe that Israel does this to allay the fears of the people and that they're going to have some kind of peaceful existence. But in the meantime, they're killing people. They have absolutely no sympathy for the people of Lebanon. So I wonder what will happen. This is just a drama to show that we are meeting with the Lebanese people. I believe that Lebanon, Gaza, and other places are going to be hot spots for a long time.
Wow. Hezbollah was not on the table, definitely, and it's a main stakeholder. It says that it will not abide by any agreement reached without it. But Hezbollah's patron, let's say Iran, is simultaneously trying to negotiate a deal with Washington that could include a regional ceasefire. So if Iran makes a deal, do you think Hezbollah would comply? Is that the only realistic path to Hezbollah standing down? And can Washington build a US-Iran deal that explicitly covers Lebanon over Hezbollah's objection?
You see, any deal that will happen has to have a focus by the Israelis themselves. I don't know how much hold now Iran, after it has been weakened, will have on Hezbollah, because remember, the main leaders are out, so these are all fragmented regional loyalties and groups that are there, unknown people, and everybody wants to have a go. But the idea is in order to show good favor and a sense, Israel first should go back and then talk to the government of Lebanon, because the government of Lebanon has been hit, not only Hezbollah. West Beirut has been hit, people have been killed, hospitals in Lebanon have been indiscriminately fired on, patients in ICU have been blown up. So I think the important thing to show a good nature and a good side, which Israel never has, by the way, and never had or ever since its illegal existence, I think what they have to do is to go back to the border and then come up and see to it that treatment first is given to the people they have injured and maimed and killed and sort of got rid of.
Yeah, I believe very few people are calling Lebanon and Gaza and West Bank or whatever is happening in Syria is a sticking point, as much as the focus is on the Strait of Hormuz, because economy seems to be a bigger problem for the world at the moment. Who's going to take stand for Lebanon? Who's going to stand for what has been happening in Gaza for a very long time, in the West Bank? It seems there is a shadow war going on and nobody's bothered about it.
I agree with you, because money talks. Remember that lives are at stake. People, farmers, doctors, students have been totally blown off by this Zionist regime, aided by the evil Zionists in America. Let me be very frank. Yes, the Strait of Hormuz is very important. What is happening in the Gulf is very important. But at the same time, we have to have sympathy. We have to have some kind of humanity for the people who are suffering in that area.
It has, to be honest, what started on October 7 has blown into something bigger than what it started as. Do you think that's deliberate? Attacking Iran, getting the focus over there, getting the focus solely on a regime they have been after for so long, and meanwhile change whatever you want to change strategically in the West Bank, in the Gaza, in the Beirut, as you said. Is this deliberate in your opinion? And keep in mind, Netanyahu's election year is upcoming.
Well, it's a part of a concerted plan. October 7 was part of the process because it did not start. It started with the Nakba in 1948, with the occupation, with the killing of the Palestinians, and now there's a big drive people don't know. They're uprooting olive trees that are 2,000 and 3,000 and 4,000 years old to claim it as their own. The Israeli threat is an existentialist threat. Now, what is happening in Hormuz? Yes, there are very dangerous alternatives if things don't go well. But this thing will continue with Hormuz, with the attack on Iran or with other attacks. I think this will continue until some kind of a stop-it sign will be made for them, whether by the Arabs or by the international community.
Do you see Arabs doing that anytime soon?
Well, it's a fragmented world. I mean, it's a very fragmented world, and I think it's important for them to sort of be more cohesive, and the mosaic should come up again. And at the same time, in Israel also there has to be a change, because in the long range, Israel is not going to win because the manpower, how are they going to control the area? They speak of Lebanon, they speak of other countries, they speak of the hegemony. How many soldiers will they need unless they get these mercenaries from America and Eastern Europe? Most of these are Polish and Eastern European, and they're going to die there. So it will be a free-for-all, but at the same time, it will cause havoc. It will stop the development of the economics in the area, social development, human development. It is causing great concern now, especially when the Gulf states were going on well, especially when Saudi Arabia was on a very charted road and a path to achieving its sufficiency by 2030. So it is a deliberate attempt by the Zionists, and I'm not a propagandist, to see to it that the Arab states will be weak economically, militarily weak, and always be at the whim and caprices of the terrorists like Netanyahu.
Just a last question. Do you think there is a realization in Arab states that this has been a deliberate effort to undermine their development?
Yes, I think it's important to know. It's also important to know that the realignment, whether it's allies, whether it is armed sources, whether it is now a realization that you have no one to help you but yourself, and in your new definite structure that you are thinking of trying to draw and the plans that you have. Time is running out, and we have seen how the attacks that were and also the destruction of the cohesion of the area by trying to make people in the country fight against each other. And here I think Saudi Arabia was very restrained. There was sobriety in the foreign policy. It did
show a lot of restraint, no doubt. Khalid Al-Mina, thank you so much. So 3 stories tonight, and here is what tonight's Decode has built, that these 3 stories are not separate. The Lebanon front is why Iran would not sign in Islamabad. Italy's move is why Israel's conduct in Lebanon has a cost. The blockade is why Iran needs a deal and why Trump needs one too before November. Everything's connected through the same question. Can 2 sides that cannot agree on who is winning agree on what a compromise looks like? 7 days, April 22nd. The ceasefire expires. Trump says amazing 2 days are coming. Iran says no information. Pakistan is all for peace. Watch Ishaq Dar. Watch Paris on Friday. Watch whether any ship gets fired upon in a 34-kilometer strait that the whole world depends on. I am Zunaira Azhar. This was tonight's Decode. We will be watching every signal and we will decode it the moment it moves. Good night.